In April 1942, the Long Island air felt like early spring, cold wind over mud and concrete, but the war made everything feel hotter than it should. At the Grumman factory at Bethpage, rows of unfinished fighters waited in the hangars, bare metal and primer paint, while workers hurried past with tools and clipboards. The assembly lines were already pushing out F-4F Wildcats, the tough little carrier fighters that had carried the United States Navy through the first desperate months of the Pacific War. But everyone in that plant knew the same hard truth. Against the Japanese Zero, the Wildcat was fighting uphill. On one particular day that month, a car rolled through the factory gates and drew more stares than usual. Inside sat Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, recently returned from Washington, where he had stood in the White House and received the Medal of Honor from the President for shooting down multiple enemy bombers in a single mission. His face was familiar from newspapers. His name had already become a symbol of hope for a country still reeling from Pearl Harbor and from the early losses in the Pacific. To the engineers and managers at Grumman, however, O'Hare was more than a hero. He was a man who had faced the Zero in real combat, who had felt how the Wildcat climbed, rolled, and stalled with enemy guns flashing around him. On that April morning, they were not welcoming a celebrity guest. They were welcoming a source of answers. For years, Grumman had been sketching ideas for a bigger, stronger fighter to replace the Wildcat. The company had signed a contract for a prototype the previous summer, back when the war in the Pacific was still only a threat on paper. The first design, called the XF-6F, was already on the drawing boards, built around a Wright Cyclone engine and shaped as a sort of grown-up Wildcat, familiar to pilots and simple for the factories to produce. Then the war arrived for real, and with it the Zero. Suddenly, theoretical performance numbers on paper were not enough. Real combat reports from the Pacific began to flood back, telling a story that no one in Bethpage could ignore. Pilots reported that the Wildcat was durable but slow to climb compared with the sleek Japanese fighter. The Zero could turn tighter and hold altitude better. It could outclimb, outturn, and often out-accelerate the American fighter, especially at low and medium speeds. The Wildcat could survive frightening amounts of damage and bring its pilot home, but it took skill and clever tactics to make up for its performance gap. The designers at Grumman listened to those reports and began to change their early ideas. They strengthened the airframe, experimented with different wing shapes, and thought about heavier armor and more fuel. But there was one thing they still lacked, and that was the raw, unfiltered voice of a pilot who had actually fought those battles and come home to talk about them. That was why O'Hare had come. Fresh from the ceremony in Washington, he traveled to the Grumman plant together with officers from the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics. They walked him through the assembly halls, where he saw Wildcats in various stages of completion, wings folded or missing, engines open, sheet metal still unpainted. He knew every curve of that airplane from hours in the cockpit above the Pacific. Now he was about to step into a different kind of battle, one fought across drafting tables and specification sheets. In a conference room above the shop floor, the meeting began. It would last roughly 4 hours. The participants were a mix of people who rarely shared the same space. There were Grumman designers and engineers, the people who lived among slide rules, stress calculations, and wind tunnel data. There were Navy officers, the ones who had to think about logistics, maintenance, training, and the brutal arithmetic of war losses. And then there was O'Hare, who had already seen what happened when those calculations met reality in the sky. Step by step, he walked them through what it felt like to fight a Zero in a Wildcat. He described the way the Japanese fighter could climb away if a Wildcat tried to chase it upward too aggressively. He explained how dangerous it was to enter a flat-turning contest, because the Zero could simply keep tightening its circle until it sat on the Wildcat's tail. He talked about the long bursts of fire from the Zero's cannons and machine guns, and the way the American pilot had to make every second of firing count from his own weapons. He stressed how critical visibility was when trying to keep sight of fast-moving enemies above the clutter of a carrier deck and the glare of the Pacific sun. As he spoke, the engineers began to map his experiences onto metal and numbers. A cockpit set higher in the fuselage could help a pilot see more of the world around him during landing and combat. A slightly lowered nose line could give better forward visibility, especially on approach to a carrier. Stronger landing gear, mounted wide in the wings rather than tucked into the fuselage like the old biplane designs, would help pilots bring the plane aboard moving decks in heavy seas. These ideas did not appear out of thin air. They were the product of years of experience at Grumman. But O'Hare's hard-earned observations gave them weight and urgency. Then came the key discussion, the one that would quietly redirect the whole future of the design. Based on numerous combat reports, and reinforced by what O'Hare described, the Navy representatives pushed for more power. More power meant not just a faster top speed, but a better climb rate and the ability to carry more armor, more fuel and more ammunition without turning the plane into a sluggish brute. The answer was already known in outline. In place of the earlier Wright engine, the aircraft should be redesigned around the much more powerful Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that promised a jump in performance of roughly a quarter compared with the original plan. This was no small change. It meant a stronger fuselage, new cooling arrangements, revised weight distribution and careful thinking about what the pilot could handle in the tight space of a carrier approach. Yet the war was forcing everything to move faster than peacetime engineers would ever have accepted. Outside, other pilots were already flying Wildcats into battle, holding the line as best they could against an enemy that still held the initiative. Inside that room, however, something different was taking shape. With each remark from O'Hare, each note taken by the designers, the idea of a new fighter became more concrete. It would have thicker armor around the cockpit and fuel system, self-sealing tanks to turn leaks into survivable damage, and wing mounts strong enough to carry both drop tanks and bombs or rockets for strikes against ships and airfields. It would be big enough to carry a heavy battery of 50-caliber machine guns, yet forgiving enough for young pilots barely out of training to land it on busy decks. The notes from that discussion would soon become formal instructions, and those instructions would rapidly turn into blueprints and production orders. By the time O'Hare stepped back out into the noise of the factory floor, the war had not visibly changed. Carriers were still at sea. Pacific Islands were still under enemy control. Wildcats were still rolling off the lines in long rows of blue-gray metal. Yet on that day, with nothing more dramatic than a long meeting and a series of hard-headed discussions, the future Hellcat had taken a decisive step toward reality. It was not yet the dominant fighter that would one day own the skies above the Pacific. It was still lines on paper and a partially built prototype sitting in a hangar. But from that day forward, the people who built it were no longer designing against guesses. They were designing against the real, deadly memory of what the Zero could do, and what a better American fighter would have to become in order to beat it. By the middle of 1942, the Grumman plant at Bethpage no longer felt like an ordinary factory. It felt like a front line that just happened to be made of steel beams and concrete instead of jungle and coral. Every new report from the Pacific seemed to echo down the assembly lines. When a carrier group fought off a raid, the workers heard about it. When pilots failed to return, they heard about that too. Against this background of urgency, the project that would become the Hellcat began to move from concept to solid metal. The decision to redesign the new fighter around a more powerful engine turned the program into a race against time. The earlier prototype, shaped as a larger Wildcat with a less powerful engine, had already been partly built. Now the airframe had to be reinforced and reshaped to carry a heavy double-row radial with far more horsepower. That change meant new calculations for weight, balance, and strength. It also meant a chance to build in features that combat experience had already proven essential. Engineers thickened the armor around the cockpit and the front of the fuselage, accepted the extra kilograms as the price of survival and trusted that the new engine would make up the difference in performance. Inside the design offices, the team reworked the wings. They needed to fold to save space on carrier decks, yet remain strong enough to carry not only the usual battery of heavy machine guns but also extra fuel or weapons under the wing. Combat dispatches from the Pacific made it clear that range and endurance were as important as agility. The new fighter would need to fly escort missions far out from the carrier, then fight and still have enough fuel to find its way back. That requirement pushed the designers toward larger internal tanks and provisions for drop tanks that could be jettisoned when combat began. Every small change in structure rippled through the entire airframe. More fuel meant different loads in flight and landing. Stronger landing gear had to handle heavier weights, slamming onto a moving deck. All the while, the Wildcat kept flying. On distant carriers, men were still climbing into its narrow cockpit, closing the canopy and rolling down wooden decks into air thick with humidity and danger. Training schools on the American coasts continued to use the Wildcat as a classroom for new naval aviators. Instructors taught tactics born out of hard lessons. They told their students to avoid turning fights with the Zero, to dive instead, to use altitude and speed whenever possible. Those tactical teachings, sometimes called the boom and zoom approach, accepted the Wildcat's weaknesses and leaned on its strengths. The new fighter taking shape at Bethpage would be built to make those strengths even more decisive. The atmosphere on the factory floor remained intense but strangely focused. There was no luxury of doubt. The war was real, and every delay meant real pilots facing enemies in machines that no longer matched the demands of the sky. Yet within that pressure there was also a quiet confidence. Grumman had already earned a reputation as a builder of rugged naval aircraft, machines that stood up to salt, spray, and hard landings. The workers took pride in stories of Wildcats returning to carriers with shredded control surfaces and bullet-scarred fuselages, still flying well enough to bring their pilots home. The new design, big and powerful and a little ungainly on the ground, seemed like the natural next step in that tradition. In the summer of 1942, the first prototype with the new engine configuration prepared for flight. It looked broader and heavier than the Wildcat when parked, with a large engine cowling and wide track landing gear that gave it a sturdier stance on the ground. Test pilots who walked around it took in the details. The cockpit sat higher, promising better visibility. The wings stretched wide, filled with guns and fuel, yet designed to fold neatly against the fuselage. This was no sleek racer. It was a working machine for carrier decks, designed to lift heavy loads, absorb punishment, and still fight hard. When the prototype finally lifted off from the runway, the immediate impression was one of power. The new radial engine pulled the aircraft into the sky with a strength that earlier naval fighters could not match. Climb tests began to show the difference. Where the Wildcat had struggled to keep up with the Zero in vertical maneuvers, this new machine showed the ability to gain altitude quickly and hold it. Engineers watched the data coming back from each test flight. They checked climb rates, top speeds, and stall behavior. They studied how the aircraft handled with flaps down and gear extended, because carrier landings were as critical as combat performance. A fighter that excelled in the air but punished its pilot on every approach would be no use in the long run. Problems inevitably appeared. No new aircraft emerges perfect from its first flights. Cooling issues, control responses, and structural vibrations all had to be addressed. Yet each problem met a determined response. Braces were strengthened, control linkages adjusted, cowl flaps modified to improve airflow around the cylinders. Test pilots reported their impressions in long debriefings that echoed the spirit of Butch O'Hare's earlier visit. Once again, real flying experience shaped the changes on paper. The difference now was that these experiences came from controlled testing rather than desperate combat far at sea. As the test program advanced, the wider war pushed relentlessly forward. The Battle of Midway had checked the Japanese advance and cost their navy precious carriers, but the Pacific was still largely an enemy-controlled ocean dotted with hostile islands. American industry was beginning to find its rhythm, producing ships, tanks, and aircraft in numbers that had been unimaginable before the war. In this vast industrial surge, the new fighter at Bethpage was one project among thousands, yet to the people closest to it, the machine already felt like a future cornerstone of naval air power. Bit by bit, the prototype shed its rough edges. Flight envelopes were expanded. Armament tests verified that the heavy battery of machine guns could fire long bursts without shaking the aircraft apart or interfering with control. Drop tank fittings were refined and strengthened. Arresting hooks and landing gear were tested with carrier-style impacts to make sure they could endure repeated hard arrivals on steel decks in all sea conditions. Every successful test run converted another line of speculation into proven capability. When the design finally reached the point where production could be planned in earnest, the scale of what lay ahead became clear. Grumman and its partners would need to build not hundreds but thousands of these fighters. They would have to train new workers, streamline supply lines, and coordinate with naval planners to ensure that carriers leaving the yards would have decks filled with the new machines. It was an enormous task, but the momentum of war industry was now fully engaged. The new fighter, still fresh from its testing phase, had not yet tasted real combat. The Zero continued to patrol the skies over Pacific Islands, and American pilots still flew Wildcats into those dangerous encounters. Yet a shift had taken place. For the first time since the surprise at Pearl Harbor, there was a sense that the United States Navy would soon field a fighter not merely adequate, but superior. The machine that had begun as a revised drawing and a 4-hour conversation was now a proven aircraft on the threshold of mass production, poised to move from quiet Long Island fields to the stormy decks of carriers heading west across the world's largest ocean. By early 1943, the new fighter had ceased to be an experiment and become a promise on an assembly line. At Bethpage and at other plants brought into the program, rows of unfinished airframes stood in various stages of completion, their wide wings bare, their engine mounts still empty circles of riveted metal. The noise inside the factories had changed in tone. Where once most of the sound had come from work on the smaller Wildcat, now more and more of it came from the heavier structure of the new machine. Jigs and fixtures were rearranged. Crates of the big double-row engines arrived and were stacked like massive steel barrels waiting for installation. The name that would become famous, Hellcat, was now attached to production orders and shipping labels. The pace of work grew almost unbelievable. Shifts overlapped, and new workers were trained even as they began handling real parts. Men and women who had never expected to be involved in aviation found themselves riveting wing skins, assembling control surfaces, or wiring instrument panels. Posters on factory walls reminded them that the machines they were building would fly over distant oceans, flown by pilots who depended on every bolt and cable. Stories circulated about how many hours it had taken to build each earlier model and how much the time had been reduced for the new fighter. Every small efficiency, every refined procedure, chipped a few minutes off the effort and added one more completed airplane to the monthly total. Yet the Hellcat still needed more than metal and engines. It needed pilots, mechanics, and deck crews who understood its size, its power, and its quirks. At training fields across the United States, rows of blue-gray fighters began to appear, their paint still fresh, their guns not yet fired in anger. Young men walked out to them with instruction manuals in their pockets and the voices of their instructors in their ears. Many had learned the basics of flying in trainers and then made the step to the Wildcat. Now they stood under the shadow of a larger fuselage, looking up at a canopy that sat higher and a propeller that seemed almost oversized. The first time a pilot opened the throttle fully on a Hellcat, the difference from earlier fighters was unmistakable. The big radial engine pulled the aircraft forward with a deep, insistent roar. Acceleration down the runway felt more aggressive, the tail lifting quickly, the landscape beginning to blur at the edges before the wheels left the ground. In climb, the altimeter needle wound upward with a confidence that gave pilots a new sense of freedom. Where the Wildcat had often felt like it was wrestling with the weight of armor and fuel, the Hellcat felt like a machine designed to carry that burden as a matter of course. Instructors emphasized that power alone was not enough. They drilled their students on handling at low speeds, on approaches to a simulated carrier deck marked on a runway, on the feel of the aircraft just above stall. The wide-track landing gear, a departure from older designs, gave a more stable footing during takeoff and landing, especially in crosswinds. The higher cockpit and lower nose line improved visibility, allowing pilots to see more of the world ahead as they lined up to land. These traits would matter even more at sea, where a missed signal or a misjudged approach could end in a crash against steel or water. As more squadrons converted to the new fighter, the older Wildcat did not simply disappear. It moved to roles on smaller escort carriers, on missions where its ruggedness still made it valuable. But on the fleet carriers that formed the heart of the Navy's striking power, the composition of the air groups began to shift. On deck, among the Dauntless and Avenger bombers, the silhouette of the fighter sections changed. Instead of the shorter, somewhat compact Wildcat, carrier decks now hosted the broad-winged, tall-finned shape of the Hellcat, wings folded straight up to save space, their tips pointing at the sky like a forest of metal. For the deck crews, the new fighter demanded adjustments. It weighed more, carried more fuel and weapons, and required careful choreography during launch and recovery. Yet it also proved robust in everyday handling. Its landing gear absorbed the shocks of abrupt carrier arrivals with the sturdy reliability the builders had promised. Arresting hooks caught cables with a solid jolt that the pilots felt through the airframe, but the fuselage took the strain without protest. Over time, the crews began to trust the aircraft as they had trusted the Wildcat, only now with the knowledge that they were working with a machine designed from the start for this demanding environment. While training and conversion continued, the wider war pushed relentlessly toward new offensives. In 1943, the United States and its allies prepared for a steady westward movement across the Central Pacific. The time for purely defensive actions had passed. Now the Navy would carry the fight toward enemy-held islands, attacking not only ships but also airfields and bases that supported the Zero and other aircraft. That meant long-range raids, carrier task forces moving within striking distance of fortified atolls, and repeated air battles over water and coral. In that emerging plan, the Hellcat was expected to do more than simply replace the Wildcat. It was expected to tilt the balance of power in the air. The first combat test came when the new fighter joined strikes against targets such as Marcus Island. Carriers approached under tight security, their locations guarded by deception and radio silence. On deck, Hellcats waited with their wings folded, loaded with ammunition, pilots strapped in and ready. When the launch order came, the deck crews moved with practiced speed. Wings unfolded and locked, chocks pulled, engines advanced to full power. One by one, the fighters raced down the deck, leaped into the wind, and began to climb toward distant clouds. Reports from these early missions told a different story than the desperate engagements of earlier months. Where Wildcat pilots had often spoken of having to avoid turning fights, Hellcat pilots described meeting Zeros on much more even terms. The new fighter could climb strongly and dive with authority, using its weight and power to maintain energy in vertical maneuvers. Its heavy machine guns delivered dense streams of bullets, and its armor and self-sealing tanks allowed it to shrug off hits that might have destroyed lighter aircraft. Pilots who had trained on the new machine discovered that many of the earlier restrictions had loosened. They still respected the Zero's turning ability, but they no longer felt trapped by it. On carriers returning from these raids, the mood in the ready rooms and on the bridges shifted. The Hellcat was proving that it could not only survive against the Zero but dominate when handled with skill. Combat reports began to show favorable ratios of enemy losses to friendly losses. Each engagement added another set of data points to the growing picture. The new fighter was not perfect, and dangers still lurked in every mission, but it was clear that a fundamental change had taken place. Back at the factories, production figures climbed like the climb rate of the aircraft itself. Thousands of Hellcats were ordered, and the industrial machine responded. Supply chains that stretched across the continent brought in aluminum, engines, instruments, and weapons. Inspectors walked the lines with clipboards, checking rivet lines, fuel systems, and control cables. Every completed fighter was more than a statistic. It was a single piece in a vast mosaic of air power that would soon cover the Pacific. Yet even as the Hellcat began to show its strength, no one could claim that the outcome of the air war was assured. The enemy still possessed experienced pilots and a wide network of airfields. New tactics and aircraft could appear at any time. The Pacific was too large, its distances too vast, for any single victory to feel final. What the Hellcat offered was not a sudden miracle, but a growing, steady advantage. With each new squadron trained, each carrier deck filled with the broad-winged fighters, the possibility increased that the next major clash in the Central Pacific would unfold under very different terms than the early desperate months of the war. That coming clash was already taking shape on maps and planning tables. It would involve multiple carrier task forces, vast numbers of aircraft, and the most intense aerial combat the Pacific had yet seen. When that moment arrived, the Hellcat would be at the center of it, carrying into battle not just its own weight of metal and fuel, but the accumulated experience of every pilot, engineer, and factory worker who had touched its creation. Through 1943 and into early 1944, the Hellcat's presence in the Pacific grew from a promising newcomer into a constant shape in the sky. Each new offensive opened with the same rhythm. Carriers advanced under the cover of night and radio silence. Then at dawn their decks came alive with the sound of engines and the clatter of deck crews. Among the dive bombers and torpedo bombers, the broad-winged fighters waited with their wings folded, lines of fresh paint catching the morning light. The early raids against places like Marcus, Wake, and then the islands of the Central Pacific were more than simple strikes. They were experiments in a new balance of power. Every time Hellcats launched, the Navy tested how far it could push its carriers toward enemy waters without losing control of the air. Fighters went out ahead of the bombers, sweeping the sky, smashing parked aircraft on runways and strafing revetments. Reports coming back from these missions carried a consistent theme. When Zeros appeared, the Hellcats were ready. Pilots described how the new fighter could climb to altitude and hold it, forcing opponents to fight under conditions more favorable to the Americans. In dives, the weight and power of the Hellcat gave it a speed advantage that pilots used again and again. Many fights began with them high above the target, rolling into a dive, building velocity and then pulling up through enemy formations, guns blazing in carefully timed bursts. They had been taught to fire at short ranges, to use their heavy machine guns only when they could see clear outlines of wings and fuselages. That discipline, combined with the Hellcat's stability as a gun platform, began to show in combat statistics. As the campaign moved westward, from the Gilberts to the Marshalls and then toward the Carolines, the Japanese air arm began to show signs of strain. Experienced enemy pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Training standards dropped as the war stretched their resources. By contrast, the United States was now producing not only aircraft in great numbers but also pilots who had been through a rigorous pipeline of instruction and practice. The Hellcat became the instrument that connected those two advantages. Squadron records from this period show a steady accumulation of victories. In engagement after engagement, Hellcat pilots returned to their carriers claiming multiple enemy aircraft destroyed for relatively few losses of their own. Maintenance crews grew familiar with the pattern. Fighters came back with bullet holes and sometimes damaged control surfaces, yet often still flyable, their pilots shaken but alive. Self-sealing tanks had turned what might have been fatal fuel leaks into manageable emergencies. Armor plates around the cockpit had stopped shells that might once have cut a pilot down. The aircraft's ruggedness was no abstraction. It appeared each day in the form of machines that limped home instead of vanishing into the sea. Within this expanding story, individual pilots began to stand out. Among them was David McCampbell, a quiet officer whose name would later be attached to some of the most remarkable tallies in naval aviation history. He flew the Hellcat in a series of actions that demonstrated both the aircraft's capability and the importance of calm, methodical shooting. Mission reports describe him engaging multiple enemy planes in a single sortie, pressing his attacks with care rather than reckless charges. He used altitude, position, and the Hellcat's power to choose when and where to fight. His personal score would eventually climb into the 30s, making him the Navy's top-scoring ace in fighter-to-fighter combat, but those numbers grew one mission at a time, each influenced by the machine under him and the training behind him. As the months passed, the Hellcat's role expanded beyond pure air superiority. Its strong wings and sturdy structure made it suitable for carrying bombs and rockets against ground targets. Squadrons began to split their missions, with some fighters flying high cover while others dove on shipping, airfields, and defensive positions. On certain raids, Hellcats returned with bomb racks empty and gun barrels smoke-stained, having spent their strength on both air and ground enemies. The aircraft had been designed with this flexibility in mind, and war now demanded full use of it. Back in the United States, production continued at a pace that would have seemed impossible before the war. Grumman and partner factories coordinated to keep the flow of machines uninterrupted. Aluminium arrived by the trainload. Engines from Pratt & Whitney moved along separate lines before being joined to airframes. In some months, hundreds of new Hellcats rolled out, their serial numbers ascending in long sequences that traced the industrial power of an entire nation. Each finished fighter represented countless hands and countless hours, yet once it left the plant, it became just one more piece of the vast air armada forming in the Pacific. By early 1944, the Navy was preparing for a major leap forward, an operation that would require everything the new fighter could offer. The Marianas, a chain of islands including Saipan, Guam and Tinian, lay deep within the defensive ring of the Japanese Empire. Capturing them would place American bombers within range of the home islands and threaten the enemy's ability to control the Central Pacific. The Japanese Navy and Air Forces could not ignore such a move. Planners on both sides understood that any attempt to seize the Marianas would likely trigger a massive naval and air battle. Inside carrier-ready rooms, officers unrolled charts and traced lines across the blue of the Pacific. They studied the locations of enemy airfields, expected routes of carrier forces and the probable composition of Japanese air groups. Intelligence reports suggested that the enemy would commit a large number of aircraft, including Zeros and newer models, and that they still possessed experienced pilots despite earlier losses. For the men who would fly the Hellcats, this meant that the days of small, scattered engagements might soon give way to a storm of combat on an unprecedented scale. On the decks themselves, the signs of preparation were everywhere. New squadrons arrived to replace older units or bring air groups up to full strength. Hangars filled with rows of tightly packed fighters, wings folded high, their markings freshly painted. Armorers inspected belts of ammunition and racks of rockets and bombs. Mechanics checked engines, control cables and hydraulic lines, ensuring that every system would respond the first time a pilot called on it. Night after night, carriers steamed westward, their wakes stretching behind them like pale scars in the dark water. For the pilots, the waiting was its own kind of trial. They knew that the Hellcats' record so far was exceptional. Kill claims from previous campaigns showed ratios that favored them heavily, numbers that would later be summarized as roughly 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for each Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat. They knew that their fighter had delivered the majority of the Navy's aerial victories in the Pacific to that point. Yet statistics on paper could not erase the reality that in the next major clash, they would be outnumbered in the air by waves of attackers launched from multiple directions. Training flights filled the days before contact. Hellcats practiced formation changes, gunnery runs and intercept drills. Pilots learned the subtle differences in fuel consumption at various power settings, how to stretch their range when patrols ran long, how to return to the carrier with reserves rather than empty tanks. Instructors and squadron leaders repeated lessons drawn from earlier fights. Do not give up altitude without a reason. Do not chase a single enemy so far that you isolate yourself from your section. Use the aircraft's climb and dive to keep control of the engagement. In quiet moments, some of the men thought back to the path that had brought them here. They remembered stories of the early days after Pearl Harbor, when Wildcats had struggled to hold their own against Zeros. They knew the story of the meeting on Long Island, of Butch O'Hare describing the strengths and weaknesses of both aircraft to the designers who had turned those words into metal. Many of them had sat at mess tables and heard older pilots talk about how different the war might have been without the changes that led to the Hellcat. Now that machines stood ready in long rows on carrier decks pushing into contested waters. The Pacific stretched out on all sides, empty and calm on the surface, but thick with unseen lines of movement and intent. Far beyond the horizon, Japanese carriers and land bases were preparing their own forces, fueling planes, briefing pilots, rolling bombs and torpedoes into position. Between these two converging masses of steel and fuel and human will lay a few hundred miles of ocean and a handful of days. When the fight for the Marianas began in earnest, the Hellcat would be launched in numbers never seen before in naval aviation. Pilots would rise from those decks into a sky crowded with friend and foe, guided by radar plots and radio calls, trusting their training and the machine around them. The long chain of decisions that had started years earlier, in design offices and 4-hour meetings and test flights over quiet fields, was about to meet the most intense test possible, high above an island chain whose name would soon be permanently linked with one of the most decisive air battles of the war. In June 1944, the carriers of the Fifth Fleet moved west of the Marianas, their wakes drawing pale scars across deep blue water. Below decks, charts showed the islands of Saipan, Tinian and Guam as tight clusters of ink, but on the open sea there was only empty horizon and hard sunlight. Above those steel hulls, flight decks stretched like floating airfields, crowded with bombers and long rows of Hellcats, wings folded, markings freshly painted for a campaign that everyone knew would be decisive. The battle that followed would be remembered by a nickname that sounded almost casual, yet the stakes behind it were anything but light. As American forces moved to seize the Marianas, Japanese commanders committed their remaining carrier strength to a single great effort. They brought fleet and light carriers, battleships and cruisers, and hundreds of aircraft, combining carrier air groups with land-based planes from island airfields. The intent was clear. They meant to smash the invasion fleet from the air, as they had tried to do at Coral Sea and Midway, and to break the momentum of the island-hopping advance. On the morning of 19 June, radar operators on American ships began to see the first distant traces of incoming formations. Controllers plotted bearing and range, then vectored fighter divisions toward the threat. On the flight decks, deck crews rushed Hellcats to the catapults and the bow, engines roaring at full power as pilots waited for the launch signal. One after another, the heavy fighters thundered into the wind and climbed, spreading out into layered barriers far in front of the fleet. What followed turned the careful design promises of the Hellcat into hard, measurable reality. Japanese strike waves came in multiple groups, a mix of fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, launched from carriers and distant island fields. Many of the pilots had limited experience, victims of a training system ground down by years of losses. They flew long distances over open water toward coordinates that had already been passed through enemy code breakers. Waiting for them were formations of Hellcats guided by radar and radio control. The new fighters met the attackers far from the ships they were meant to defend, diving out of the sun, using superior speed, climb and firepower to tear into the oncoming formations before they could organize for attack runs. Accounts from that day describe scenes that bordered on the surreal for those in the cockpits. Hellcat pilots reported rolling into one enemy group after another, firing short, disciplined bursts, then climbing back to altitude to attack again. Some described seeing bombers begin their dives only to trail smoke and break apart before releasing their weapons. Shipboard anti-aircraft fire added another layer of danger for the attackers, guided by new proximity fuses that detonated shells near their targets. The combined effect of radar control, heavily armed fighters and dense shipboard fire produced a level of defensive power that the Japanese air arm had never before faced. Within this broader storm of combat, individual feats stood out. Hellcat pilot Alex Vrashu, for example, intercepted a group of enemy dive bombers and shot down 6 in a matter of minutes, a single pilot's work that symbolized the wider imbalance in training, tactics, and machine. Other pilots in different squadrons recorded 4 or 5 victories in one sortie, the sky around them filled with twisting contrails, falling aircraft and the flicker of exploding ammunition. These were not simple hunts. Fuel limits, scattered formations and the constant danger of collision or friendly fire turned every engagement into a test of discipline as well as nerve. By the end of the day, Japanese carrier air power had been shattered. Estimates vary, but roughly 500 or more enemy aircraft were destroyed in the 2-day battle, many of them in the great waves that tried and failed to break through to the American carriers. By contrast, American losses in the air were a fraction of that number. The lopsided nature of the aerial fighting led one pilot to compare it to a country fair shooting contest, a remark that spread through ready rooms and into official histories as the phrase that named the event. Behind that nickname lay a brutal arithmetic. The Imperial Navy had lost the core of its trained carrier air crews. It would never again be able to mount a truly large-scale carrier air offensive. The battle did not end with defense alone. On 20 June, American carriers launched a long-range strike late in the day, sending Hellcats and bombers far across the sea to attack the retreating Japanese fleet. Pilots flew near the limit of their range, hit enemy carriers and oilers in fading light, then turned back toward their own ships with fuel gauges slipping toward empty. Many had to ditch or divert in the darkness, guided home by searchlights and flares in what became known as the Mission Beyond Darkness. Even in this hazardous offensive role, the Hellcat showed its value as an escort and attack platform, carrying bombs under its strong wings while still ready to fight enemy aircraft when needed. For the men on the carriers, the days after the battle brought a dawning understanding of what had changed. The Marianas campaign would continue on the ground, with bitter fighting on Saipan, Guam and Tinian, but in the air above the Central Pacific a threshold had been crossed. Carrier air groups built around the Hellcat now faced an opponent stripped of many of its most experienced aviators. Where earlier in the war American pilots had entered combat wondering whether their machines and tactics could match the Zero, they now flew knowing that their fighter, their training and their support systems together gave them a clear edge. This shift showed up not only in stories but in the cold figures tallied after the war. Hellcat pilots flew more than 66,000 combat sorties and claimed over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, with an overall kill-to-loss ratio of roughly 19-1. In the broader accounting of the Pacific Air War, the type was credited with around 3/4 of all aerial victories recorded by the Navy and Marine Corps. Hundreds of pilots reached ace status in the process, among them David McCampbell, whose personal total of 34 victories made him the leading Navy ace and the top Hellcat scorer. On paper, these numbers described a weapon system performing beyond the hopes of its designers. In human terms, they represented countless individual encounters where the difference between life and death could come down to a few knots of speed, a little extra climb, a tank that did not ignite, or a canopy that protected its pilot from shrapnel. The Hellcat's rugged design, its powerful engine and its forgiving handling made it possible for many pilots to survive their early missions, gain experience and become more effective with each sortie. That survivability turned into a multiplier for skill, and that skill fed back into tactics and training for the next wave of air groups. Out over the Marianas in June 1944, all of those threads came together. Radar technology, shipboard fire control, improved pilot training and the brutal lessons of earlier battles all mattered. Yet in the swirling dogfights above the fleet, the shape that most clearly symbolized this turning point was the broad-winged fighter first sketched on drawing boards in Bethpage years earlier. The machine born from urgent conversations, combat reports and patient testing had become the standard bearer of American carrier air power, and in the skies of the Philippines Sea it had helped to break the back of an opposing air arm that had once seemed almost untouchable. After the battle over the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat did not fade into the background. It became the everyday face of air power across the Central and Western Pacific. Wherever a big carrier sailed, rows of the broad-winged fighter went with it, wings folded like metal arms against their sides, ready to unfold and fly on a few minutes' notice. On hangar decks below, mechanics and armorers moved between them in a constant routine of refueling, rearming, and inspection. The war was still raging, but the character of that war in the air had changed. The Hellcat was no longer the newcomer. It was now the standard. Behind these front-line images stood an industrial story that was almost as striking as the combat record. At the Grumman plants and at partner factories, the fighter that had once been a fragile prototype was now a product built in astonishing numbers. From 1942 to 1945, more than 12,000 Hellcats rolled out of the lines. In just 2 years, roughly 11,000 of those aircraft were completed, a pace made possible because the original design proved sound and needed only modest changes as the war progressed. Assembly lines settled into a rhythm where metal, engines and weapons arrived, moved through jigs and tools and left again as complete fighters, ready to be shipped to training bases or straight to the fleet. Workers learned to recognize subtle differences between early and late production machines. Some aircraft still carried small windows behind the cockpit. Later ones replaced them with solid structure to simplify production and improve protection. Yet to most eyes the Hellcat remained the same familiar shape. A large radial engine at the front. A high-mounted cockpit. Broad wings with room for heavy guns, ammunition, fuel and, when needed, bombs or rockets. The details evolved, but the core lines that had first flown in 1942 stayed in place. On the other side of the world, those production numbers turned into squadrons. New air groups formed and old ones re-equipped. Pilots who had cut their teeth on earlier types, and others who had only ever known the Hellcat, now found themselves flying over names that would soon be etched into history. The Marianas were followed by the Philippines. The Philippines would lead on to battles nearer to Japan itself. Across these campaigns, the Hellcat became what one historian later called a strategically significant fighter, a machine whose presence altered the course of operations rather than simply filling a role in them. In this period, the figure of David McCampbell came to represent what a skilled pilot could do with a capable aircraft and strong support behind him. By mid-1944, he commanded a carrier air group and flew the Hellcat from the deck of the carrier Essex. He had already made his mark during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but his most famous day came later, in October 1944, as the largest naval battle of the war began around the island of Leyte. On the morning of 24 October, Japanese forces launched air attacks in support of a complex plan to strike the Allied invasion fleet. Over the Philippines, a large formation of enemy aircraft moved toward the American ships. McCampbell and his wingmen climbed to intercept in their Hellcats. Radar plots and radio calls guided them into position. When they finally saw the enemy, they were facing dozens of aircraft. Later accounts would estimate that they were outnumbered by more than 30 to 1. What followed has been retold many times, but at its core it was a contest between training, discipline, and the qualities of the machine. McCampbell used altitude and the Hellcat's power to choose his attacks. He dived on enemy fighters and bombers in short, controlled bursts, then climbed back up rather than staying down in the chaos of turning fights. His wingmen did the same. Over a mission that lasted around an hour and a half, the two men broke up the formation again and again. When they finally turned back toward their carrier, McCampbell had shot down 9 enemy aircraft in a single flight, and his wingmen 6 more. It was a record for an American naval pilot and a symbol of how far the balance of skill and equipment had swung since the early months of the war. McCampbell's total score by the end of the war reached 34 victories, making him the leading fighter ace of the United States Navy. Yet his story was not just about numbers. It illustrated how the Hellcat allowed experienced pilots to survive long enough to accumulate knowledge and turn that knowledge into repeated success. Thick armor around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a tough structure meant that many men who might once have been lost in flames or explosions now came home in damaged but flyable aircraft. That survivability created a core of veterans who then led newer pilots into combat, passing on tactics that made better use of the fighter's strengths. While individual aces drew attention, most of the war in the air was fought by men whose names did not become widely known. They flew long patrols over empty ocean, searching for submarines or shadowing enemy task forces. They escorted bombers on strikes against airfields and shipping. They flew ground attack missions against coastal batteries, supply depots, and troop concentrations. In the Philippines, at Iwo Jima and later at Okinawa, Hellcats dived through flak to hit targets that were often only a few hundred meters from friendly troops. They returned with shrapnel scars on their wings and fuselages, tires shredded by rough field conditions, engines hot and strained from long climbs and quick escapes. As the war moved closer to Japan, a new and deadly threat appeared in the form of suicide attacks. Pilots of special units were ordered to crash their aircraft into ships, turning their entire plane into a guided weapon. Defending against these attacks required early detection and brutal efficiency. Hellcat squadrons flew continuous combat air patrols around fleets, climbing to intercept any contact that might turn into a diving attacker. In these situations, there was no time for drawn-out dogfights. Pilots had to climb, identify, fire at close range, and break away, all before the enemy crossed the last few seconds of sky that separated them from the ships below. The Hellcat's heavy armament and stable firing platform made it well suited to this grim task. Back in the factories, the war's end was not yet visible. Production continued even as Allied victories mounted. Train cars still brought aluminum and steel. Engines still arrived on flatbed trucks. Inside the plants, the sound of rivet guns and the smell of oil filled the air day after day. Supervisors tracked output on large wall charts. The target was always higher than the month before. Although the last Hellcat would not roll off the line until late 1945, the core of the fleet's fighter strength had been created much earlier, in the intense 2-year period when 11,000 aircraft were built. That speed, achieved without sacrificing quality, was one of the quiet achievements that underpinned the more visible triumphs in the Pacific. The link between frontline pilots and assembly line workers ran through every detail of the aircraft. A riveter in New York might never know that the panel he had secured would one day be part of a wing that carried a pilot safely back from a night patrol near the Philippines. A machinist turning out engine parts could not see the moment when a pilot opened the throttle to climb away from tracer fire. Yet the chain was real. In after-action reports and personal letters, many pilots recognized it, writing about the toughness of their machines and the way those machines had absorbed punishment. By the time the war entered its final year, the numbers attached to the Hellcat had grown impressive. It had flown tens of thousands of combat sorties and destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, with loss rates that reflected the growing skill gap between Allied and Japanese aviation. In total, the fighter would come to be credited with roughly 3/4 of the aerial victories recorded by the United States Navy and Marine Corps. The aircraft itself was not solely responsible for that record. It functioned within a system of radar, logistics, carrier tactics, and pilot training. Still, to anyone watching the Pacific skies in 1944 and 1945, the broad wings and high cockpit of the Hellcat were the most visible sign of that system at work. Amid all this success, however, there was an absence that many in naval aviation felt keenly. The man whose detailed combat experience had helped shape the aircraft in its early days was no longer alive to see the full extent of its achievements. Years earlier, he had walked through the Grumman plant and spent long hours explaining how it felt to fight a nimble enemy in a slower, older fighter. Now his name was attached to medals, to ships, and eventually even to an airport, but not to any future briefings or squadron meetings. His story, and the way it intersected with the Hellcat's rise, carried a different kind of weight, one that blended innovation, courage, and a loss that came much earlier than anyone in those factory conference rooms might have expected.